I'm reading a book right now called The Noticer by author Andy Andrews. Now, I can't tell if this is a fictional story or if it's just a series of true leadership snippets told in such a creative and compelling way that it almost feels like fiction. But regardless, I highly recommend the book The Noticer by Andy Andrews. In the book, he tells of a woman named Willow Calloway, a 76-year-old widow whose husband had been dead for years. Her children were, of course, grown and gone, and they had children, her grandchildren, and those children had children, her great grandchildren. She barely saw any of them because they lived so far away. She goes across the street from her house and she sits on a bench and just kind of sits there, wondering once again if her life really matters at all. And as she sits there, she happens to meet a passerby by the name of Jones, who is the main character in the book. And in his endearing way, Jones was able to gather Willow's story out of her, and he attempted to encourage her that her life was not over and done, but that she could still have an influence. And starting to actually believe him, she said, "It would be nice to know that I was making a tiny difference." Well, Jones quickly began to reorient her thinking to let her know there's no such thing as a tiny difference. There's no such thing as a tiny impact. And I want to read a few pages from this interaction between Jones and Willow and then simply wrap this up with a scripture and a powerful reminder. Now, I'm going to be reading several pages here, so this will probably seem a little lengthy, but hopefully you'll be captured and captivated by this story. Jones asks, "Do you know the name Norman Borlaug?" Willow shook her head. Norman Borlaug was 91 when he was informed that he had been personally responsible for saving the lives of 2 billion people. 2 billion people? Willow exclaimed. How is that even possible? Norman Borlaug was the man who hybridized corn and wheat for arid climates, Jones answered. The Nobel Committee, the Fulbright scholars, and many other experts calculated that all across the world, in Central and South America, Western Africa, across Europe and Asia, throughout the plains of Siberia, and America's own desert southwest, Borlaug's work has saved from famine over 2 billion people, and the number is increasing every day. Incredible, Willow said. Yes, Jones agreed, isn't it? But the most incredible part of the story is that Borlaug, for all the credit he has received, Jones glanced around as if to prevent someone from hearing what he was about to say. For all the credit he's received, Borlaug was not the person who saved the 2 billion people. What? That's right, Jones confirmed. I believe it was a man named Henry Wallace. He was vice president of the United States under Roosevelt. I thought Truman was the vice president under Roosevelt, Willow said suspiciously. He was, Jones agreed. But remember, Roosevelt served 4 terms. His first 2 terms, John Nance served as vice president. His 4th term, Truman. But it was during Roosevelt's 3rd term that his vice president was a former Secretary of Agriculture named Henry Wallace. And while Wallace was vice president of the United States, he used the power of his office to create a station in Mexico whose sole purpose was to somehow hybridize corn and wheat for arid climates. And he hired a young man named Norman Borlaug to run it. So, while Norman Borlaug won the Nobel Prize, it was really Henry Wallace whose initial act was responsible for saving 2 billion lives. I never knew, Willow said. Why, I don't even remember the man. Well, that's okay, Jones replied. Now that I think about it, maybe it wasn't Henry Wallace who should have gotten the credit anyway. Willow appeared startled. Now, why would you say that? She asked. Well, Jones dropped his eyes to the ground and rubbed his chin, as if deep in thought. Maybe it was George Washington Carver who saved the 2 billion lives. And then his head popping up again, he said, You remember him, don't you? Yes, Willow answered quickly. Peanuts. But what is he... What people don't know about George Washington Carver is that while he was 19 and a student at Iowa State University, he had a dairy sciences professor who allowed his own 6-year-old boy to go on a botanical expedition every weekend with this brilliant student. George Washington Carver took that little tot and directed his life. And it was Carver who gave 6-year-old Henry Wallace a vision about his future and what he could do with plants to help humanity. Jones shook his head in wonder. Isn't it amazing? Carver would spend all that time with the peanut, hours and months and years of work. I mean, the man developed 266 products from the peanut that we still use today. And then there's the sweet potato, 88 uses he developed from it. Jones leaned forward, hands on his knees. He also wrote an agricultural tract and promoted the idea of what he called a victory garden. Willow smiled. I remember victory gardens. We had one. Yes, so did most people, Jones said. Victory gardens, even in the middle of major cities, fed a significant portion of our population during World War II. But with all the time and effort and years that Carver spent on things like peanuts and sweet potatoes and victory gardens, isn't it amazing that a few afternoons with a 6-year-old boy named Henry Wallace turned out to make that much difference? Truly, Willow said with awe in her voice. So it was George Washington Carver whose actions saved all those people. Joan shook his head. Not really. What? Well, it had to have been the farmer from Diamond, Missouri. Jones grinned as Willow threw up her hands. There was a farmer in Diamond, Missouri named Moses, Jones continued, who had a wife named Susan. They lived in a slave state, but didn't believe in slavery. Well, that was a problem for those crazy people who rode through farms at night, terrorizing what they called sympathizers. And one cold winter night, Quantrill's raiders attacked Moses and Susan's farm. They burned the barn, shot several people, and dragged off a woman named Mary Washington, who refused to let go of her infant son, George. Now, Mary Washington was Susan's best friend, so Moses sent word out immediately, trying to arrange a meeting with those cutthroats, trying to do something to get Mary and her baby back. Within a few days, he had the meeting set. And so, on a January night, Moses took a black horse and went several hours north to a crossroads in Kansas. There, he met 4 of Quantrill's men who arrived on horseback, carrying torches, wearing flour sacks with eye holes cut out over their heads. And Moses traded his only horse for what they threw him in a burlap bag. As they thundered off, Moses fell to his knees. There, in the freezing dark, with his breath's vapor blowing hard and white from his mouth, Moses brought out of that burlap bag a cold, naked, almost dead baby boy. And he opened up his jacket, and he opened up his shirts, and placed that baby next to his skin. Moses fastened that child in under his clothes and walked that baby out, talking to that child every step of the way, telling the baby he would take care of him and raise him as his own, promising to educate him to honor Mary, his mother, who they knew was already dead. Jones looked intently at Willow, who stared back in wonder. That was the night, he said softly, that the farmer told that baby he would give him his name, and that is how Moses and Susan Carver came to raise that little baby, George Washington. So there. It was obviously the farmer from Diamond, Missouri, who saved those 2 billion people. Jones would go on and talk to Willow some more, and he would kind of wrap up the discussion by saying this: no matter your age, physical condition, financial situation, color, gender, emotional state, or belief, everything you do, every move you make matters to all of us and forever. When Jesus fed the 5,000, he looks at the crowds and he has compassion on them and he says, let's feed these people. And in John chapter 6, verse 9, Andrew comes up to Jesus and says, there's a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish, but what are they for so many? What are they? In other words, what impact can 5 loaves and 2 fish make? Well, the answer is nothing. But see, what are they? That's the wrong question. The right question is, who is he? Who is Jesus? Because Jesus can get behind the smallest amount you offer and he can work a miracle. Even if you never even see it for yourself. Don't forget this. And so may you make a difference in your worship ministry as you faithfully give what you have, making, quote unquote, a tiny influence, a tiny impact, so that Jesus can make the difference by his power. Just a thought for you this week.